Good morning, everyone from Seattle. I'm Xiaojing Wu, Atsuhiko and Aina Goodwin Tateuchi Foundation Curator of Japanese and Korean art at the Seattle Art Museum. Welcome to our spring lecture series, Sites of Memory in Asia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge we're on the traditional homeland of the Duwamish and the customary territories of the Squamish and Muckleshoot peoples. As a cultural and educational institution, we honor our ongoing connection to these communities, past, present, and future. We also acknowledge the urban native peoples from many nations who call Seattle their home. At the year 2020 witnessed removal of over 100 public monuments in different parts of the world. We conceived the topic of this lecture series, Sites of Memory, to take a critical look at some poignant history of building or demolishing monuments in Asia. The 4 talks in this series will offer case studies in North India, Japan, West India, and China. Each will reveal a highly charged story. So come join the conversation every Saturday morning, 10 to 11:30 in April. It's our hope that those thought-provoking lectures will broaden our perspectives and help us think current events more critically through the lessons we learn from history. Next slide, please, Sophie. In acknowledgement of the tragedy in Atlanta and a sharp increase of anti-Asian violence, we would like to reiterate our support for Asian communities and our commitment to providing a platform for all voices. Through our educational programs, the Gardner Center for Asian Art and Ideas always fosters dialogues about Asia's art, culture, history, politics, and its relation with the rest of the world. Here we celebrate diversity and embrace multiculturalism. Next slide, please. The recordings of last lecture series, Art and Renewal in Times of Crisis in Asia, are available on Sam's YouTube channel. If you go to Seattle Art Museum YouTube and click Playlists tab, you should be able to find Saturday University lectures recordings. And a brief survey will pop up after Q&A today. We would really appreciate it if you could fill it out. Next slide, please. I would like to thank our longstanding partners for Saturday University lectures, the Jackson School for International Studies at the University of Washington and the Elliott Bay Book Company. Next slide. Sophie, next slide, please. Sophie, next slide, please. Can I go to the next slide? For today's lecture, our presenting sponsor is the South Asia Center at the University of Washington, and co-sponsor is the South Asia Art Initiative at University of California, Berkeley. And I would also like to add a thank you to our coordinator, Linnea Hodge, and AV manager, Sophia Zimmerman, for their indispensable behind-the-scenes work. Now I'm turning it over to my colleague, Natalia de Biancantonio, Sam's curator of South Asian art, to introduce our speaker today. Natalia, hand over to you.
Thank you, Xiaojin. It's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Audrey Truschke, Associate Professor at Rutgers University. For many of you, you know her work. She is quite prolific, writing numerous articles and books, most notably Culture of Encounters, which received the John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History. And that was in 2016. She recently wrote the book Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King, which received in 2017 the Choice Awards for Outstanding Academic Title. And her third book has just come out, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. She's also working on a one-volume history of India to be published by Princeton University Press. So from this, you can just see that Professor Truschke is well-versed and one of the leading scholars in South Asian history. But today she'll be discussing a sensitive and controversial subject about the demolition of sites across North India. Saturday University has always been a space for intellectual debate and learning. We ask the audience to be respectful and to put their questions in the Q&A while she is speaking, and you can also hold off if you're waiting for her to give you a little bit more historical background. So with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Truschke.
Let me screen share and I'll start. All right, so thank you so much to Natalia for that very kind introduction. Thanks as well to Xiaojin for inviting me, and to everyone at the Seattle Art Museum for making this event happen today. And to my audience, a good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I want to speak with you all today about the making and the unmaking of sacred landscapes in parts of northern India. And my starting point here, the way I want to get us into this topic, is through action. So I submit to you that a place becomes sacred when people act like it's sacred. So sacredness, it's not inherent in a place. It's not enough to say that a particular space or building or piece of land is sacred. It's not even enough to believe that it's sacred. You have to act in the world to transform whether a spot on earth or a building or whatever that space is into something more. Those actions, whatever they might be, then have to be repeated or somehow reinforced over time. Otherwise, the sacredness is sort of lost. It kind of evaporates. I want to trace with you today some of these processes, a bit about how specific groups of people in northern India have made places sacred, or alternatively, have made them mundane. So let me open today with an example of the latter, meaning a loss of sacredness in the North Indian landscape. And my example here is going to be Sarnath. Okay, and I'm choosing Sarnath because it's important in and of itself. Also, it allows me to introduce some of the bigger themes that will guide our discussion today. So Sarnath is a town. It's in northeastern India. I've marked it in red on Google Maps here. The deer park at Sarnath is said to be where Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, first taught his Dhamma, his teachings, around the 5th century BCE. So the Sarnath overall, and particularly the deer park there, it's pretty strongly associated with Buddhism and this sort of specific important moment in Siddhartha's life. Now, after the Gautama Buddha's death, or as Buddhists would see it, his final nirvana, his final release from the cycle of rebirth, Sarnath became a sacred place, as Buddhist communities over the centuries built monasteries there, they put up pillars, and they also built stupas. All right, and for those who are not familiar, a stupa is a sort of large rounded mound. Okay, in the photo you can see on the screen, the big thing in the center, that's the main stupa at Sarnath. Typically, a stupa will contain relics, often of the Gautama Buddha himself. Due to its being built up and being made sacred, Sarnath was then on Buddhist pilgrimage routes for centuries. And pilgrims, in turn, by coming and doing certain kinds of activities there, reinforced and recreated its sacredness. Let me give you just one example, which is that in the 7th century CE, a Buddhist pilgrim known as Xuanzang traveled from China and visited Sarnath. Okay, by this point in history, Buddhism had quite some time ago reached China. You can see a map of Xuanzang's travels here, right? I mean, it's a very circuitous route that he takes to get to India. He was on the road for years, right? His travels were extraordinarily extensive for pre-modernity, especially. He was even able to see things that we can no longer see today. And I think the most poignant example there is probably the Bamiyan Buddhas, which used to be in Afghanistan until their destruction two decades ago. So Xuanzang, why are we talking about him? We're talking about him because he went to Sarnath. He went there because it was important to him to see this sacred space associated with the main founder of his religious tradition. And by going there, he also helped to keep it sacred, both by going and then also, of course, by sharing his experiences. Eventually, several centuries after Xuanzang's visit, active Buddhist practice at Sarnath came to an end. Right? This is probably in the early 2nd millennium CE. Now, exactly what happened to Indian Buddhism and how it sort of evaporated from most of the subcontinent, this is a huge question. All right, it's a big unanswered question, in my opinion, in South Asian history. All right, and I'm not going to address it here, but I did just want to flag it for folks that this is an ongoing matter of scholarly inquiry and debate. For us, I want to pick up the narrative after Sarnath's loss of sacredness. All right, for hundreds of years, it was no longer sacred. People didn't go there so far as we know. Now today, you can visit Sarnath, and I'll say more on that in just a moment. But like many other Buddhist sites in India, Sarnath strikes many people more for its loss of sacredness rather than for any preservation thereof. And to capture a bit of that loss, I thought I'd read you just a few stanzas from a poem by Meena Alexander, who's a well-known Indian poet, and her poetry is often deeply historical. So these are stanzas from her poem titled Deer Park at Sarnath. It seems impossible to begin, to speak of those gone ahead intact, fired by breath. Through flowering mustard, they race past a main road northwards to the deer park. In the terrible kindness of the dead, they whisper as they pass, inscribe yourself if you can on brick or bone or slate, then surrender it all with grace. A few stanzas later in the same poem, she writes, clouds consume the palaces of the gods, stone chariots stir in soil. All Sarnath is covered in dirt. Now, the Sarnath that was covered in dirt and more or less forgotten about for centuries has become imbued with new meanings today. It's part of a modern Buddhist pilgrimage circuit, so there is sacredness there now, but of a sort that there's a break with pre-modern forms. It's also an excavation site, as archaeologists have literally removed some of the dirt that accumulated over the centuries, and thereby revealing further ruins. As an excavated area, Sarnath is also a modern tourist site far beyond the Buddhist community. And here you can see a map marking some of the key spots and ruins. This is the sort of map that if I were to go to Sarnath, maybe take some of you, maybe take some of my students, I would use a map like this to plot out our modern tourist route through the site. Sarnath in modern times has also been claimed as the heritage of all Indians. So there's a sort of national sacredness there as well. And the best example, I think, is probably the lion capital. So the lion capital, and you can see two images of it here, one more or less in situ when it was found a little over a century ago, and then another in a sort of modern, kind of a bit cleaned up version in the museum at Sarnath. This lion capital was patronized by Emperor Ashoka. Okay, he ruled in the 3rd century BCE, and he converted to Buddhism. He also patronized Sarnath. Now, the lion capital once topped a pillar, obviously no more. It is It was, I should say, a symbol of ancient Ashokan sovereignty. But when it was rediscovered, it was then adopted as an emblem of independent India. Okay, and this happened in 1950. Now, as many, hopefully all of you know, India gained independence from the British in 1947. So pretty early, just a few years later in 1950, the Ashokan lion capital becomes a model of newly independent India. Today, you can find it all over the place. It's on stamps, it's on currency. Right here, I'm showing you images of it on various denominations of rupee bills. And it represents not really Ashokan sovereignty anymore, but rather the sovereignty of the modern Indian nation. By and large, this adoption is not controversial. And as far as I know, no one really has a huge issue with this. That's possibly for a couple of reasons. There are relatively few Indian Buddhists around today, and those that are largely converted in the 20th century. Right? And that's a different story, but there's a pretty big historical break between almost all modern Indian Buddhists and pre-modern forms of Indian Buddhism. I think that separation helped the vast majority of non-Buddhist Indians to not object to using this symbol to express their common heritage. But heritage is not always conflict-free. I began here with Sarnath to introduce you all to some of the big concepts in how and I think a lot of people think about sacred space: history, action, memory, forgetting, and heritage. But now I want to pivot, and I want to further investigate this fruitful set of ideas using another example that is contested, very contested in modern day India, which is the former site of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya and the temple of Ram that is being constructed on that very spot. So let me introduce you to this contested sacred space that involves two Indian religious communities that are very much alive and robust today: Hindus and Muslims. So the Babri Masjid, okay, that phrase means Babur's mosque. It is, or really it was, a pre-modern mosque. Now, Babur, he was the founder of the Mughal Empire, which was one of the larger empires in South Asian history. Babur founded the Mughal Empire in 1526 when he seized Delhi from the Lodi dynasty. Okay, the Lodis were another Muslim dynasty, or Muslim-led, depending on how you want to parse that. A few years later, 1528, one of Babur's generals sponsored the construction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. Okay, and he named it for Babur. Then, for over 300 years, nothing happened. At least nothing that we know about. This actually makes really good sense. The Mughals and their associates built a number of mosques. All right. As a side note, many people who worked for the Mughals also built Hindu temples. Okay, so they're sort of building in various religious traditions in this period, but that's a different story where I'm focusing on the Babri Masjid right now. Long story short, there was just nothing that unusual about it, and it was just another mosque. But then in the mid-19th century, we have our first historical record that pops up of a dispute over this mosque. Okay, and this is in the 1850s, over 300 years after it was constructed. At that point in time, a group of Hindus claimed that Lord Ram, who is a Hindu god and a mythological figure, was born at this very site in Ayodhya, where the mosque stood. The objecting Hindus said that they wanted to worship Ram on this very spot of his birth, which was a problem because there was a mosque on that spot. Now, we don't know where this idea originated. That Ram had been born in Ayodhya, people had been saying that for 2,000 years, possibly even more. But in terms of Ram being born on this spot in Ayodhya, we have no mention of that idea before this event in the 1850s. but honestly, it makes really good sense that this would arise in the mid-19th century. Okay, this is about midway through the British colonial period, and the British more or less happily stoked Hindu-Muslim tensions during this period as part of their broader strategy of divide and conquer. From the 1850s into the early 1990s, so for about 140 years, there were numerous episodes and conflicts as Hindu groups tried to encroach on the Babri Masjid in a variety of ways. This culminated in a spectacular act of violence in 1992. On December 6th, 1992, a Hindu or Hindu nationalist mob tore down the Babri Masjid brick by brick. This was an act of incredible destruction. It's a visible sign of how contested a building can be, such that a large mob can collectively feel that it should not exist and then make it so through force. Now, sometimes people look at these images of the early part of the day of the destruction of the Babri Masjid, because nothing was standing by the end of the day. Sometimes people look at these photos and they think it looks chaotic. All right, and I'm sure it was chaotic in the moment, but this was not spontaneous. Okay, this was a highly planned event with a lead up that took years. It was coordinated by specific political and cultural groups in India who, generally speaking, lean towards Hindu nationalism. Now, I want to mention to you just one aspect of the planning. Okay, and I'm mentioning this one aspect because it allows us to see how a different claim of sacred space was being created. One that viewed the sacred space of this land in Ayodhya as explicitly political. Okay, and I really do mean political here in a contested and an exclusive way, in contrast to the Sarnath lion capital, which was politicized for all Indians. This is a different, more narrow sort of politicization. So the one moment is this. In 1990, L.K. Advani, who was a major figure in India's BJP, okay, a Hindu nationalist party, led a yatra, a journey or a pilgrimage. Now, at this point, for folks who are unfamiliar, let me give you a basic definition of Hindu nationalism. Okay, Hindu nationalism is a form of ethno-nationalism. It advocates the supremacy of Hindus in modern-day India, especially over Muslims, who are India's largest religious minority. Hindu nationalism is in direct conflict, most people think, with the founding of the Indian nation as a secular homeland for members of all religious traditions. Now, today, the BJP, the party of which Advani is a part, the BJP today is the dominant political party in India. But this is not quite the case in 1990. All right, in 1990, there was much more of an internal debate within India about the merits of Hindu nationalism. And the Babri Masjid is in part actually a tale of how long-term the BJP gained political power. But I'm not telling you that story, right? I'm telling you the story of Advani's yatra, right? And how it created a sort of politico-sacred space. So L.K. Advani, he was on the road for about a month and a half, all right? And he rode around in a Ram Rath. That's what he called it, Ram's chariot, all right? It was sort of like a souped up truck van thing, all right? Designed to look like Lord Ram's chariot. And in doing this, he was projecting himself as the inheritor of Ram's tradition, as the protector of this Hindu deity, possibly even with moments of overlap where you could view him as Ram, maybe. You can see Advani's route here, okay? And he began in the west and sort of wound his way towards the east. Now, the goal of this yatra was specifically to call attention to the cause of wanting to build a Ram Mandir, a temple to Lord Ram in Ayodhya, okay, on the very spot of the Babri Masjid. And keep in mind that in 1990, that masjid was still standing. As Advani went, he left a trail of violence in his wake. Okay, and I like this map because it marks clashes and how many people were killed in specific locations when Advani was there or shortly after he left. Advani's twisted, violent pilgrimage carved out a new kind of politically sacred space. And this was a space that was marked not by unity, but rather by militancy, division, and a projection of physical strength, expressed in the ability of a Hindu majority to enact violence on India's Muslim minority. For a point of reference, roughly 80% of modern Indians are Hindu, 14% are Muslim. Now, Advani's yatra succeeded in a sense, really, yeah, that's a fair statement. It brought a lot of attention to the Babri Masjid situation, right? And it sort of directly led into the unleashing of violence, which brought down the mosque in December of '92. After the mosque was dismantled, there were riots across northern India for weeks. A few thousand ended up murdered, primarily Muslims. Now, as I mentioned, the goal of bringing down the mosque was to pave the way for the building of a temple to Lord Ram, the Ram Mandir, on the very site of his alleged birth. And by the way, that phrase Ram Mandir, I mean, in theory, that can refer to a whole bunch of different temples, like there are lots of Ram Mandirs. But today, if you say Ram Mandir, we all know you mean the Ayodhya one. Now, the desire to build a temple to Ram on the spot of his alleged birth in Ayodhya has been and continues to be expressed with the Hindi phrase, Mandir vahi banayenge. The temple will be built right here. Not over there, not across the street, not down the road, but vahi, right here. Now, a quarter of a century later, a quarter of a century after the destruction of the Babri Masjid, and after the 2019 conclusion of a really messed up court case that I'll tell you more about in a minute, it's happening. The mandir is under construction as I speak, possibly not literally as I speak. It's like midnight or something in India, but you get my sense. It will be completed in a couple of years. The Babri Masjid Ram Mandir affair is and continues to be quite a journey in terms of the making and unmaking of sacred space and attempts to redefine the nature of modern India, including by using religious ideas. Now, thus far, I've primarily told you about this through a scholar's eyes, and that makes sense, right? I'm a scholar. But I want to just shift gears just a little bit, and I wanted to tell you what this looks like a little bit more on the ground in terms of popular history. After that, I will switch back to the scholarly realm because I can't help myself, but also because I do want to comment specifically towards the end on how this set of events has shaped a generation or more of scholarship on South Asia. Now, one place where we might begin to sort of access popular memory regarding this set of events is within the 2019 court case about Ayodhya that was decided by India's Supreme Court. Now, the case was very complex. There were a lot of angles, all right? But at its essence, it revolved around the question of what would happen to the land after the destruction of the Babri Masjid. There were two basic options. One, Muslim communities could retain control of the land, whether they wanted to build a new mosque there or do something else with it. Or two, the land could be given over to Hindu groups to build the Ram temple. The court decided the latter. And the final verdict said that in the 1992 mob destruction of the Babri Masjid was illegal. But nonetheless, the court gave the land to Hindu communities to build their temple. Now, many people have drawn attention to the grave injustice of this decision. It's entirely unjustified on legal grounds, but that was never really the playing field here. What I want to do is I want to emphasize some of how the court reasoned in order to arrive at this verdict. All right, and let me just mention briefly that the verdict itself is a very rich document. If you're into historical documents, which I am, because it's almost 1,000 pages, among other things. So the court's verdict It speaks about broad religious communities of Hindus and Muslims without ever defining those broad categories, okay, in a way that makes me as a historian, and I imagine all historians, cringe. Moreover, from the start, the court assigns both facts and beliefs about Ayodhya to specific religious communities, right? Thus creating this sort of false equivalence. So consider this very early line from the verdict. The Hindu community claims the disputed Ayodhya property as the birthplace of Lord Ram, an incarnation of Lord Vishnu. The Muslim community claims it as the site of the historic Babri Masjid, built by the first Mughal emperor, Babur. At the core of this comparison is an astonishing false equivalence. The belief about Ram's birthplace is just that. It's a belief. It's a matter of faith that is definitionally, because it's a matter of faith, unprovable. In contrast, that a mosque sat on that land between 1528 and 1992 is a well-documented basic fact. Actually, the existence of a mosque on this land is just about the only thing not in dispute in this entire affair. All parties agree that a mosque indeed stood there for hundreds of years. Now, I'll circle back in a moment to the unequal treatment of Hindu and Muslim communities throughout the verdict. But first, I want to really underscore the choice in that division and its implications for heritage. Right? The Indian Supreme Court did not have to divide this way. Throughout the nearly 1,000 pages of the 2019 Ayodhya opinion, there is no hint whatsoever that the loss of the Babri Masjid was a loss for all Indians. There is no indication of that. And from where I sit, it was indeed a loss for everyone. Babur period mosques are rare. That's both because it's been nearly 400 years, so a lot of time has passed, and also because Babur only rules for 4 years. He died in 1530, so not that many Babur period mosques were ever built. Now we have one less irreplaceable part of Indian heritage. Surely this can be construed as a loss for all Indians. That's certainly how I see it. But that's not how the Indian Supreme Court and popular memory overall chooses to perceive the possibilities of the mosque, which in their view can only be for Muslims. Now, if the Babri Masjid can only be for Muslims, well then in popular memory and perception, can the future Ram Mandir be only for Hindus? The popular answer here is sort of both yes and no, and also it just doesn't matter. India is experiencing this political swerve to the hard right at the moment, as Hindu nationalism, that political ideology that advocates Hindu supremacy, continues to gain steam and redefine Indian society. Part of Hindu nationalism is the idea that Indian and Hindu identities are one and the same. That attempted collapse of religious and national identities leaves the 20% of non-Hindu Indians in a pretty precarious position. And indeed, minority communities in India, especially Muslims, after them Christians, tribal groups, and others, are suffering from accelerated oppression and violence in recent years. In terms of sacred space, Hindu nationalism creates the potent and dangerous potential to collapse religious and political forms of sacrality into one, thus redefining both. And that appears to be what's happening with Ram Mandir. One very striking thing to me about the 2019 Supreme Court Ayodhya verdict is that it actually just speaks about Hindus more than Muslims. Right? And that disproportionate attention is represented on this slide by the relative size of the two images. Ultimately, the court's final judgment that Ram Mandir be built because some Hindus want it declares unequivocally that Hindus matter most in modern day India. Now, the Ram Mandir, when completed, will surely be one of the most important temples in northern India. Okay, historians don't predict the future very much, but I'm comfortable with that prediction. The implications of this for the sacred landscape of northern India are staggering. Already there are plans underway to make it possible for millions to visit annually. Fundraising efforts to pay for the temple are ongoing. Notably, there are substantiated allegations that people are being forced to give money, whether they want to or not. So there's this sense that participation in this new kind of religio-political sacrality, it's not optional. And that sort of coercion, it's really part of the project as I see it. This temple is supposed to represent, embody, and compel a more martial sort of Hindu identity. One way to see this is actually just to compare devotional images of Lord Ram with ones associated with Hindu nationalism and the Ram Mandir. So in the image with the purplish background, right, this is your sort of devotional Ram. And this is a sort of common, popular modern depiction. He's calm, he's peaceful, he's carrying a weapon, but the bow's not drawn or anything. He holds up his hand in blessing. Compare this to the other image, Ram in motion, setting off with bow and arrow at the ready, the envisioned Ram Mandir in the background. Right? He even has defined muscles. This is a far more martial rendering. And so this set of events is changing even the nature of iconography of Ram as he becomes an ever more potent political symbol. Now, going along with this display of force and this embrace of some more martial sort of Hindu identity, the one undisputed fact about the land on which Ram Mandir will sit is this: it used to house a mosque. There's no denying that the Mandir will sit and will always sit on the graveyard of a religious structure that once housed Muslim worshippers and was destroyed in modern times. As I see it, this is not an unfortunate fact for many who advocate for Ram Mandir. Rather, it's part of the vision. It's a statement of dominance that's built into the very fabric of this project. And it attests to how unmaking a sacred landscape can be essential to crafting a different kind of sacredness. Now, at this point, I want to take us in a slightly different direction, just for a couple of minutes. And I want to consider with you explicitly how this set of events has changed the landscape of scholarship on South Asia and the reception of scholarship on South Asia. The destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992 sent shockwaves through the scholarly community, both in the United States and elsewhere in the West, as well as in India. Many academics engaged in various ways with the fall of Babri Masjid. They analyzed it, they wrote articles about it, so on and so forth. It also shaped a generation of scholars moving forward, and I am part of that. Now, I want to be clear that I knew nothing about Babri Masjid when it fell. Okay, I was 10 years old, I was living in the American Midwest. I'm quite certain I could not have identified India on a world map. Okay, so I knew nothing about this at the time. But for scholars at the time, it awakened interest in a couple of things. Number one is scholars began to work more on Hindu-Muslim interactions in pre-modernity. Okay, and scholars had had a sense for a long time that Hindu-Muslim relations in pre-modern India were not characterized by conflict, not the sort of religious-based conflict that characterizes much of those relations today. Okay, so they knew that, everyone knew that. But if it wasn't a relationship characterized by conflict, well, then what were Hindu-Muslim relations like? Right? Many scholars set out to answer that broad question in specific contexts. Second, this set of events made scholars of South Asia see whether they wanted it to be like this or not, that their work had political implications. And so, a decade later, when I was in college and decided to pursue a PhD in South Asian studies, what I chose to work on and how my advisors suggested that I proceed, this was all against this larger backdrop. And so, for example, my first book, Culture of Encounters, in that work, I worked on translations of Sanskrit text into Persian at the Mughal courts, specifically at the court of Akbar, who was Babur's grandson. This is a story about cross-cultural exchange, even collaboration, not conflict. These days, there is a lot of pushback against scholars and scholarship, including me in my work, by those who favor political rewritings of the past. And specifically, our detractors want to project Hindu and Muslim conflict, this colonial and modern thing, into pre-modernity, where it simply just isn't a major dynamic. And the last 30 years, roughly, of scholarship has drawn attention to this variety of other ways that various Hindu and Muslim communities and members thereof related to one another in pre-modernity. Hindu nationalists perceive that scholarship as a liability to their political project. As a result, my colleagues and I, we face hate mail, we face defamation campaigns, threats to personal safety, and more. It's truly extraordinary, all right, but I've actually needed armed protection in order to speak on US soil about pre-modern Sanskrit text. That remains extraordinary to me. Now, there's much to say to explain the sort of high levels of animosity and politically fueled pushback against scholars of South Asian studies, okay, because we pursue history free of political restraints. And I've said much of that elsewhere. But let me just say a word specifically on what this looks like in India. Okay, because our colleagues in India, they face all the same stuff we face here and then a whole lot more. Okay, especially given the current political climate, Hindu nationalist pressure has been relatively successful in recent years. Just in the last few months, we've seen high-profile resignations, for example, because some of India's leading academics have said that they can no longer pursue humanities-based research within Indian universities. Many Indian textbooks and syllabi have been rewritten or are in the process of being rewritten, generally to feature nationalist glory stories rather than history. And I highlight this particular angle of this set of attacks in both the US and India to point out that, in a sense, one of the main ideas of our detractors is really to redefine the nature of scholarly inquiry. And here's where I can sort of circle back to sacred space. Because as it stands, the modern academy and scholarship, it's not a sacred space, not in any conventional understanding of that term, or at least not in my conventional understanding. Our highest held value is critical inquiry. Iconoclasm and questioning are very welcome. Here, you see one shot of the campus where I teach. Well, where I taught before the pandemic and will physically teach again, hopefully sometime soon, okay? Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. This is a secular space. It is devoted to critical thought. But in putting pressure on academics to toe a particular religious or ideological line, there's pressure, in a sense, to create this environment of sacrality, right, which would supplant the academic mission of free inquiry. This is something that academics across the board do not want to have happen. It's a threat to our very existence, right? And our ability to do things such as talk about the nature of sacred space in pre-modern and modern Northern India on an April Saturday. Just as space is made sacred by actions that mark it as such, so too does scholarship have to be continually done and reinscribed in order to be kept decidedly not sacred. In brief conclusion, let me circle back to Northern India. We're in this moment when North India's sacred landscape is undergoing immense change. The Babri Masjid is gone, the Ram Mandir is under construction, but it's not yet complete. So we're watching the creation of a politicized kind of sacred space. But to return to one of my early themes, which is the loss of sacredness, there is loss too embedded in the construction underway in Ayodhya. Loss of a mosque, loss of a piece of Indian heritage, and loss perhaps of the option to consider that mosque as the heritage of all Indians. Let me end with another piece of poetry, this one by Jagannath Azad, who wrote these lines in a poem about the fall of the Babri Masjid in 1992. What you have broken is the image of reverence of India. Do you have this idea, you who have broken the dome of the mosque? Not the building, but our hearts have been broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for that very engaging talk and the visuals so rich. I remind the audience to put your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom, and I will moderate them and give them over to Professor Truschke. I'm going to be a little selfish and ask the first question. If you could just give us a little bit more detail on Sarnath and the Sarnath pillar, because when I teach it to, in my undergrad survey of art history, we talk about its translatability in that, that the pillars can both index Hindu texts as the Axis Mundi in the Rig Vedas, to it moving to Allahabad, the Allahabad pillar for Jahangir. And so it already kind of through the course of its visual history was able to move through all these sacred spaces and still hold its form. And so it made sense a little bit for kind of Nehru then to return to the pillar and to the capital itself. And so could you just tell us a little bit more about that history? And do you think it's about its mobility in a way that the Babri Masjid just could not ever be because it's a complete site versus a pillar and a capital?
That's a very rich question. Thank you for that. So I take your point that there is a sort of longer history stretching back into pre-modernity of Ashokan symbols, multiple Ashokan symbols, I would say, sort of being used and reused in various ways. I would point out, stuff like the Axis Mundi of the Rig Veda. That's a modern projection. I would define it as, like, you can say that, but I'm not aware of anyone saying that before the 20th century. And so there's agency there. There's a choice. And I suppose one thing I would say is that I think that part of what enabled that choice was that Buddhism was not controversial, because there weren't Buddhists around, not from pre-modern times, right? There were Ambedkarite converts, but that was a bit later. And so I think that helped with that choice, because if you look at Indian history, right, it's long, it's rich. There's a lot of symbols that can be seen to cut across religious lines, and one could have adopted. So I guess I was specifically trying to explain maybe part of why this symbol would not have been controversial when so many have been. In terms of the mobility, I hear you. The Babri Masjid can't be moved except by being destroyed. I wouldn't want to go too far, I guess, with that. There are a lot of non-movable buildings that haven't been destroyed, right? And there are things that can be moved that remain controversial as well.
Thank you for that. And to someone in the audience was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about if Buddhist spaces were ever targeted for this type of erasure. As you mentioned that because Buddhism is not widely practiced anymore within South Asia, it's not considered as controversial. So I can't think of any kind of Buddhist spaces within South Asia that were targeted, but do you know of kind of any historical sites?
I mean, so I would distinguish clearly between pre-modern and modern here. So in the early part of the second millennium CE, right? So the 10th through 12th centuries, specifically, there are Buddhist sites that were sacked by people sort of coming in and doing raids in northern India, right? So the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, these sorts of folks, and they hit Buddhist sites for the same reasons that they hit Jain and what we now call Hindu sites, which is that's where the money was. That's where the wealth was, right? So, Jain temples, Hindu temples, Buddhist monasteries, that's where you're going for the gold in pre-modernity. So there are a couple of sort of, well-known instances where that happens. But I mean, in terms of modern times, I mean, I'm not aware of that sort of erasure. Nothing comes to mind, at least. Let me also just say a footnote on why I had this phrasing, like what we now call Hindu temples, right? So just a friendly reminder that the term Hindu was not in wide use for most of the second millennium CE. It was coined about 1,000 years ago, and it was not always specifically a religious term. So it is anachronistic in the sense that we use it now.
Thank you for that. And also just a reminder of, when you were speaking, I didn't even forgot all those instances of when various sites would be looted across the history of South Asia, but kind of this destruction of the Babri Masjid was unique in that it was razed to the ground completely, and versus kind of this other history parallel in a different way. If we can think about monuments in that form. But there was a question by Michael Ruby, who's wondering if there are other significant mosques around around Babri Masjid. He says that he's reminded of the Spanish construction of a cathedral in Mexico City on the site of the Aztec temple. In other words, did Ayodhya site become sacred because the Babri Masjid made it so?
Right. I would love to know more about the Mexico City case. So it's very hard to say because we don't know when and where the idea came that the site of the former Babri Masjid was Ram's birthplace. I don't think that was an idea around in the 16th century. It's not, historically speaking, and especially in Sanskrit, pre-modern Sanskrit text, there's an assumption that Ram was a real guy, that he lived, that he was born in Ayodhya, but there's like zero interest in exactly where in Ayodhya, right? That's something that we don't have attested to until the 19th century. That said, a lack of evidence is just that, it's a lack of evidence. So I can't say with certainty how far back this goes. What I can say is that this idea first emerges in the 19th century. So if I had to endorse, sort of which likely came first, the construction of the Babri Masjid or the belief that that very spot was Ram's birthplace, my money, if I were a betting woman, would be on the construction of the Babri Masjid coming first. But that remains ultimately unprovable with the evidence that we have. So historians do what we do. We hedge and we work with degrees of certainty.
Thank you. And then someone, if you could just, because there's people with various backgrounds coming in asking questions. You mentioned Bamyan in the beginning. And if you could say a little bit about just kind of the destruction at that site as well, and just give a little background on that.
Sure. So the Bamyan Buddhas were these sort of huge carved Buddhas, like really, really, really big. I always show my students images of them with people in them because the people are like itty bitty, and then like the statues are huge. They were carved into a rock face in what is now modern day Afghanistan, and the Taliban blew them up as part of their sort of specific brand of extreme iconoclasm. In 1999, I want to say. And I think they've now been reconstructed, at least in part, but obviously the original ones are gone forever. So it's another example of modern day destruction, which I think I and all scholars, we separate sharply modern cases of destruction of religious images and sites from pre-modern.
Thank you for that. And then the next question comes from Professor Aryafani from UW, and he asks, how did the British colonial apparatus transform Muslim and Hindu identities and relations into a racialized paradigm wherein Hindus are framed as natives or locals and Muslims are seen as foreign to India, which is a very deep and rich question, and however way you want to take that.
Yeah, I actually I recently asked my students a version of that question on our midterm, precisely because this is for History of South Asia, part 2 class. And I asked them that question precisely because it forces them to synthesize information from like all of our readings. So that's a big question, if an excellent one. So I think what should I emphasize here? Let me emphasize one aspect. Okay, which is that part of how the British sought to create division and this sort of like, Hindus versus Muslims at all places and all times was precisely through scholarship, right? Through colonial era scholarship. And this is a problem. I mean, this is a huge problem, right? I mean, we're still doing South Asian studies, South Asian history today. And yet it has these sorts of roots. And so, for example, one thing that the British did was they would selectively translate texts in order to emphasize instances where Muslim rulers claimed, or actually were, it's a combination of the two, to be doing like warfare activities, raids, so on and so forth. And then they'd like cut out the other parts where they were doing other stuff like ruling or interacting with Hindus, so on and so forth. So they created this sort of apparatus of translated materials that gave deliberately a misleading view. And the British benefited from this. Right? They were trying to justify the unjustifiable, which is colonialism, and creating divisions and having people identify, Hindus and Muslims specifically, identify each other as enemies was helpful. They also wanted to make pre-modern Indian rulers across the board, and many of those right before the British were Muslim. They wanted to make them look bad because then the British look better by comparison. And then this sort of stuff still, it still kind of tricks people today. People still cite colonial era translations of sources. I often use this as a great example of why it's important to learn the languages in which pre-modern texts are written and go back to the originals so you can read it for yourself.
Great point at that, for those of us who just love historical documents, it's always interesting to see how what is missing in the various translations that come about and what is present in the historical text. And sometimes you just find some very rich materials that are excised because it didn't fit within the paradigm of what history should look like. But there are quite a number of comments, not necessarily questions, but just about comparisons. For instance, Michael writes, the remaking of sacred spaces between religions seems very human, such as Jerusalem, Cordoba, and Granada, Spain with churches inserted into mosques and many other sites. And someone else commented about how Confederate statues in the US are deemed sacred. And you opened up your talk about how sacredness and sacrality is a process that is made and not just inherent. Can you think of a parallel case in the 90s that this, in comparison to the Babri Masjid, as the US were awakening us to this moment of the importance of monuments, that is parallel to, in a global perspective, with the Babri Masjid?
It's a good question. Nothing comes to mind as an obvious comparison, but one contrast does come to my mind, right? I mean, the awakening to problematic monuments that you mentioned. I mean, this is part of a larger story of Western societies, specifically confronting our racist past, right? And sort of, seeing that we have long made things sacred that should not have been made sacred, and that this has repercussions even today, and that like we really need to deal with this. This is very different than the destruction of the Babri Masjid, which did not address some sort of long-standing issue or anything, right? This was a much more sort of forceful exercise of a very hateful political ideology. Natalia,
I'm
muted.
And well, I want to give you this question because you've written so much about this, but if you could just, another large question, but perhaps you could give us a one great example. You spoke a lot about in the pre-modern era, how Hindu-Muslim relations differed. If you could just give us maybe some of a Sanskrit text that you've translated from a chapter from one of your books, and just tell us a little bit more about that.
How to pick from the stars in the sky, right? So I would just say off the bat, it's hard to talk about, and I know I did in this talk for shorthand, but Hindu-Muslim relations, like the obvious historian's question is like, who are these Hindus and who are these Muslims, and like why are we using these broad religious categories? So I've written in my work about Sanskrit and Persian interactions or Rajput Mughal interactions, right? I mean, there's other more precise ways of framing those identities, but to give perhaps for me the easiest example. So I told you about Babur, right? He founds the Mughal Empire. And, Babur dies 4 years later, so he doesn't, get to enjoy the empire very much. His son Humayun basically messes everything up, gets kicked out of India for 15 years. So we'll just kind of gloss over Humayun's problems. That brings us to Akbar, the third Mughal king. He's the real maker of the Mughal Empire. Okay, without Akbar, we would talk about the Mughal kingdom, not the empire. So Akbar spends a lot of time on the battlefield, warring, so on and so forth, to build a land-based empire. But in when he's not doing that, he's really interested in Hindu texts, particularly Hindu texts written in Sanskrit, right? The sort of ancient literary language of India. And he wants to know what they say. So for example, he devotes a whole team of people. Okay, I think it's 4 or 5 Persian-speaking people and then 4 or 5 Sanskrit-knowing pundits to translate the Mahabharata, one of the 2 great Hindu epics. Okay, so for those who are not familiar, think like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? We have 2 epics in India as well, but they're like a lot longer and more spectacular. All right, you really should read them. Anyway, so this team of people, it takes them like 4 years to translate the Mahabharata. And Akbar's like super into it. Like there are passages being read out in his court. He's questioning the translation. And then this sort of circles back to the art world, because once the translation is complete, Akbar orders these sorts of lavish illustrations to the manuscript. And today we have numerous illuminated Persian Mahabharatas. So if you just like Google like Mahabharata painting, you're probably going to get a bunch of Mughal stuff coming back on Google Images. And it's now a sort of major part of South Asian art history as well. So in terms of making sense of this, there's no conflict, there's no bloodshed, right? I mean, this is a Mughal king who happened to be Muslim, who my argument is that he's trying to figure out what it means to be an Indian king. Right? The Mahabharata is about everything under the sun, but if it's about one thing, it's about kingship. Okay. And he's searching, as I see it, for, what are my resources for thinking about who I am now as emperor in northern India.
Thank you for that very specific example, and also bring us back to kind of visual texts, and a reminder again that art can be signified again and again for different reasons. And here with the Mahabharata, meaning it kind of has this political tinge rather than a religious, I mean, the religious significance is there, but rather for kind of Akbar's translation project, as you said, it was about kinship. primarily. So very fascinating question. If you could also, there are a few comments about one, I think one of your former students says hello, and very grateful that you're representing Rutgers. But you also in your talk talked a little bit about how academic spaces are meant to be secular, but are becoming, in a way, more questions of sacrality are being infused in these spaces. Can you think of an example of a site or monument or an art object that is kind of up for debate at Rutgers or any other site, to bring it back to kind of an art object?
An art object. That's a good question. I don't know if I can think of a specific one, but I mean, I would say a general issue. I don't know if you guys have had this at the Seattle Art Museum, but I mean, this is like a recurrent issue: is what do you do with devotional Hindu images, right, of the gods and goddesses? If you show them as they're normally shown in a sort of Western art context, they're unadorned, right? So there's no paint, you don't put painting on them, you don't dress them, you don't put flower garlands on them. But it's not how these images were ever viewed in their original devotional context. You would always adorn the god or goddess. And there have been instances where some Hindu communities sort of take exception to this, right? Or have even come into museum spaces and tried to treat objects in a devotional sense. And so you have a question there of kind of what do you do about that?
Yes, that's always the question of how, many objects within museums across the United States, they were intended to be worshipped. And so how do you still honor that its place, but also have it more available to different audiences as well? I think it's a line that we're all still thinking about, and with restitution, all that as well. So not a light topic to tread on either. But there's a question for Mimi, and she's wondering if you could speak a little bit about maybe the rise of nationalism globally, and how kind of that is inflecting not only within South Asia, but do you see that permeating and affecting kind of other nations as well?
That's an excellent question, Mimi. Yes. Yeah, I think I agree with many commentators who have pointed out that we are sort of living through and have been for roughly a decade, give or take several years on either side, this sort of turn towards the right. And India is a very prominent example of that, partially because it's big, right? There's over 1.3 billion Indian citizens today. It's the world's largest democracy, except it doesn't act like a democracy all that often anymore, right? It increasingly acts like an authoritarian state. So its democratic status is sort of in doubt. But yeah, we've seen this in Brazil. We recently saw in the United States for 4 years. And so, I guess I leave it to modern historians to figure out like why this is happening. From my perspective, specifically as a historian who's generally trying to do work on pre-modernity, although I obviously do modern stuff these days as well, I think where I feel this pressure is when people start vociferously objecting to my scholarship. And not because they have a different view, right? Like scholars, we argue with each other as long as the sun shines in the sky. That's all perfectly fine. But people who vociferously object because they simply don't like what I say, because it conflicts with their political precepts and ideology. And especially in this sort of right-wing turn, that yelling is often very loud, and it's often accompanied by threats to do more than yelling, right? And that's a problem that chills academic freedom.
And the next question's actually for Mimi. And so, Mimi, if you could unmute yourself at the moment. does the Dalai Lama reside within India without threat?
Oh, I don't feel qualified to answer that particular. I don't feel qualified to answer that particular question. I would throw it back to our speaker.
I mean, the Dalai Lama indeed lives in India. I'm not. I would say I'm equally unqualified to answer questions specifically about threats or anything like that.
I think he's a universal personality, and for peace. So, and it basically is, he's controversial with China more than any other place because of the status of Tibet. Anyway, that.
No, thank you both for answering that question. Sorry, Mimi, I saw on the Q&A that it says you were going to answer it live, so not to put you on the hot seat like that.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't mind.
But I think that's a good note to end on this question of peace and how can we coexist in such a charged environment, especially when, as Audrey noted, and let us think through this wonderful case studies across South Asia and sacredness being remade and made over again. So with that, I'll thank the audience for staying and asking your very lively questions.